So, history, right? It's basically just a bunch of stories. I mean, we hope they're true stories, like they're based in fact. And if you want to show off, you can always talk about like historical narratives or hegemonic discourses or interpretive frameworks. But fundamentally, that just means stories. We take all the stuff that we think we know about the past and we stitch it together into a story that makes sense to us. And here's the thing about stories: where you choose to begin a story can significantly affect how you feel about that story. Hansel and Gretel, for example, is a fairy tale about a couple of plucky young children who are abandoned by their parents and kidnapped by a witch, but overcome those challenges through a combination of perseverance and cunning. If we started Hansel and Gretel near the end, though, you might think it was the story of a couple of juvenile delinquents who murder a poor old lady by pushing her into her own oven. Like, oh my God, that is brutal. So your starting point matters. And that leaves us with a big question. If we're here to tell the story of human life on Earth, where should we start? Classes like this often get rolling around 5,000 years ago with the first real city-states in Mesopotamia, aka the dawn of civilization. And as different as life in like Eridu or Ur or Babylon was from our lives in 21st century America, when we look at these societies, we actually see a lot that's familiar. They lived in cities. They had writing and religion and government and money and laws and war. They had divisions between rich and poor, ruler and ruled, male and female. If we start here, we might think that this is what being human is all about. We might see the last 5,000 years as the story of steady progress, as our cities became larger, our technology became more advanced, our governments became more representative, our wars became deadlier. That's kind of progress. But what if we take a step back? Another obvious starting point is 12,000 years ago with the Agricultural Revolution. That's when people living in what we now call the Middle East first learned to control their own food supply by cultivating plants like wheat, barley, lentils, and peas. And other agricultural centers popped up too, we think independently, within a few thousand years. You had millet, rice, and soybeans in China, sorghum in Africa, corn in Central America, potatoes in the Andes, sugarcane in New Guinea, and so on and so on. We'll talk about all this next week, and I'll argue that from a broad perspective, the agricultural revolution is one of just two truly, significantly, deeply important events in all of human history. Spoiler alert, the other one's the Industrial Revolution. For today, though, how does our perspective change when we begin the human story with agriculture? Well, for one thing, maybe we shouldn't be talking about like cities and writing and kings so much, because without all the extra food grown by farmers, we never would have been able to support cities filled with people who specialize in, reading or praying or killing people. The fact is, for most of the past 12,000 years, we didn't have cities or writing or kings. And even after cities developed, the vast majority of people still lived on farms. Believe it or not, according to the United Nations, the world's urban population only surpassed its rural population sometime around like 2010. And this should maybe cause us to rethink our ideas about slow and steady progress, because when you get down to it, the life of a farmer in ancient Egypt wasn't all that different from the life of a farmer in medieval France, which wasn't all that different from the life of a farmer in 19th century Vietnam. Like, basically, you worked all the time, you had a very limited diet, and you had about even odds of dying before you turned 35. That stuff didn't really change until just the last 200 years or so. But let's take another step back. Our best guess is that Homo sapiens first appeared about 250,000 years ago. So like farming, cities, kings, civilization, all of that squeezes down to less than 5% of our time as a species on this planet. For most of the human story, we have been foragers, hunters and gatherers, living in small bands of maybe a few dozen people, mostly connected by family ties, and mostly with no permanent settlements. It's hard to say too much about these people because they never wrote anything down, but based on archaeological and other evidence, they probably actually had more varied diets than early farmers did. And on average, they probably lived a little longer too, though by modern standards, still not that long. They probably also experienced less inequality and less hierarchy, though also more violent death. So, you give a little, you get little. Virtually no one lives like this today, even people on the paleo diet. But it is still recognizably deeply human. Think about it. You might live in a city of millions. You might know hundreds of people by name. You might have thousands of friends online. But how many genuine personal relationships do you actually have? That number is probably in the dozens. And it probably includes a lot of family, just like it would have for your distant ancestors 200,000 years ago. But take another step back. About 7 million years ago, the line of our ancestors diverged from the ancestors of our closest living relatives. If you want to know what it means to be human, you could do a lot worse than thinking about what separates us from the chimps and the bonobos, and what we have in common. Now, an enormous step back. Life on this planet originated nearly 4 billion years ago. From that perspective, all of humanity is just a tiny blip, something like 0.006% of the history of life on Earth. Okay, one last step back. Our best guess is that the universe itself began about 14 billion years ago with the Big Bang. Now, on that scale, we are pretty insignificant. Or, in the words of physicist Stephen Hawking, the human race is just a chemical scum on a moderate-sized planet orbiting around a very average star in the outer suburb of one among 100 billion galaxies. Think about that when you're trying to fall asleep tonight. So which of these starting points should we choose? Well, clearly I chose all of them. As for where you should begin your story, that's kind of up to you.